No! Get back!
Keep your nose down, boy. Find it.
They called him a broken man chasing ghosts when he inherited a rotting, forgotten manor on the edge of a dying mountain. But the laughter died when his loyal German shepherd clawed through the shattered floorboards to reveal a secret buried in the stone. Jax Harlan left pieces of his soul in a desert half a world away, and his only tether to this life was Smoky, the heroic war dog who refused to let him fall. When society threw them away, a dead man's final gift dragged them into the fight of their lives, a fight worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching this story from. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. The rain had been falling long before the horizon even considered the dawn, a relentless, bone-chilling downpour that washed the color from the world and left only a bruised, metallic gray. It drummed a heavy, rhythmic beat against the rusted roof of an old, battered pickup truck, sitting alone in the cracked asphalt of a forgotten roadside gas station. Inside the freezing cabin, the shadows were thick, heavy with the weight of unslept nights and unspoken memories. Suddenly, Jax Harlan woke with a violent, breathless gasp. His hands instinctively tore at the steering wheel, his knuckles turning a stark, translucent white as his heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. The harmless sound of the heavy raindrops slapping against the windshield had warped and twisted in the depths of his sleeping mind, transforming into the sharp, deafening crack of distant gunfire echoing through a desolate, sun-scorched valley half a world away. He squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving with shallow, jagged breaths as he fought to separate the ghosts of the past from the cold reality of the present. "Easy," he whispered into the freezing air, his voice cracking like dry timber. "Easy, Jax." Beside him in the passenger seat, a massive, powerfully built German shepherd lifted his magnificent head. Smoky did not bark, nor did he whine. The dog simply watched his companion with eyes that held an ancient, quiet wisdom, eyes that had seen the same horrors, the same blood, the same endless stretches of unforgiving sand. Smoky shifted his weight, moving his large, warm head across the center console to rest heavily beneath Jax's trembling right hand. The physical pressure, the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the animal acted as an anchor thrown into the stormy seas of Jax's mind. Smoky had learned long ago that when his handlers said he was fine, it was usually a desperate lie. Jax let out a long, shuddering breath, burying his fingers deep into the thick, coarse fur behind Smoky's ears. The phantom echoes of the battlefield slowly receded, leaving behind the hollow, echoing emptiness that had become his daily companion. Outside the fogged windows, the world was a blurred smear of early morning misery. A lone 18-wheeler rumbled down the interstate, its tires hissing violently against the standing water, a temporary disruption in their isolated universe. This rusted truck, this endless ribbon of highway, and the loyal dog beside him, this had been the entirety of Jax Harlan's life for over a year. He had once been an elite operator, dedicating 15 years of his youth to the service, surviving deployments that had stripped him of his friends and his innocence. Somewhere in the back of the truck, buried under old blankets and heavy coats, sat a small wooden box holding a chest full of medals of valor that he could no longer bear to look at. When the military had finally sent him home, they told him he had survived, but survival was a complicated word. The doctors attached heavy clinical labels to his suffering, calling it severe post-traumatic stress. But to Jax, it was much simpler and much crueler. The war had simply never ended. It had packed its bags and followed him across the ocean, hiding in the shadows of civilian life, waiting to ambush him in the quiet moments of the night. He had tried to integrate. He had taken jobs in construction, late-night security, manual labor in shipping yards, but the crowds made him suffocate, the sudden noises sent his body into defensive spirals, and the sleep deprivation eventually gnawed away his ability to function. The jobs faded, the small apartment was packed into boxes, and then there was just the open road, the rumbling engine of a dying truck, and Smoky. Smoky had been his tactical partner during his final devastating tour. The German shepherd possessed a terrifying intelligence, trained to detect hidden explosives and track hostile movements through the most jagged, unforgiving terrain on Earth. But far beyond his tactical utility, Smoky had been Jax's guardian angel, placing his own body between Jax and the Reaper on more than one occasion. When an explosion sent shrapnel tearing into Smoky's flank, ending the dog's military career, Jax had made a silent vow. He marched into the commanding officer's tent and refused to leave the theater without his partner. The military discharged them both. They had bled together on foreign soil, and now they slept together in the cab of a freezing pickup truck, discarded by the very world they had sacrificed everything to protect. "We're all right, brother," Jax murmured softly, his voice finally finding its steady timbre. "Just you and me." Smoky offered a single, comforting thump of his heavy tail against the worn fabric of the seat. Jax pushed open the heavy metal door, stepping out into the biting wind of the Wyoming plains. The freezing rain instantly soaked into the shoulders of his faded canvas jacket as he stretched a spine that ached with the memory of carrying too much weight for too many years. Across the cracked asphalt, the neon lights of the gas station flickered to life with a sickly yellow buzz. The morning clerk, a young kid with heavy eyes and headphones around his neck, was unlocking the front doors. Jax pushed through the glass doors, a small bell announcing his arrival with a tired, pathetic jingle. The interior smelled sharply of burnt, hours-old coffee and the harsh chemicals of industrial floor cleaner. He walked to the back, pouring the cheapest black coffee available into a styrofoam cup, and grabbed a small, overpriced package of dried beef jerky for Smoky. The clerk barely looked up as Jax handed over a few crumpled bills, entirely accustomed to the ghosts who drifted along this stretch of highway, men who carried their homes on their backs and their regrets in their eyes. Jax stepped back out into the freezing deluge, dropping the tailgate of the truck. Smoky hopped down with practiced grace, sitting dutifully by Jax's side as the veteran tore open the plastic packaging. They shared the dried meat in silence, the rain washing over them, two old soldiers finding a fleeting moment of profound peace in a chaotic world. It was in this quiet moment of morning stillness that the local mail carrier pulled into the lot. The postal worker, bundled in a thick waterproof coat, stepped out of his vehicle carrying a large bound stack of envelopes bound for the station's rural drop boxes. Jax paid him no mind. He hadn't received a piece of personal mail in nearly 2 years. The world had lost his address, and he had been perfectly content to let it remain lost. But the carrier paused, flipping through the stack, his eyes scanning the rusted license plate of the truck, then looking up at the scarred, bearded man sitting on the tailgate. "Jax Harlan?" the carrier asked, his voice carrying over the sound of the rain. Jax froze, a sudden cold knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. The carrier walked over, extending a thick, heavy envelope. The paper was premium, water-resistant cream parchment, the kind that screamed of high-rise offices and exorbitant billing hours. Jax wiped his wet hand on his jeans and took it. The return address was embossed in crisp black ink. The law offices of Sterling and Vance, estate execution, Denver, Colorado. "Got to sign for it, man," the carrier said, holding out a damp electronic clipboard. Jax scribbled an illegible signature, his mind racing through 100 different scenarios, all of them bad. The carrier nodded and walked away, leaving Jax staring at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. Smoky nudged Jax's knee with a wet nose, sensing the sudden spike in his handler's heart rate. "Yeah, buddy," Jax breathed. "I don't know either." With careful, deliberate movements, Jax tore open the seal. He unfolded the thick documents inside, shielding them from the rain with his body. The legal jargon was dense, but the opening lines struck him like a physical blow. "Dear Mr. Harlan, it is with profound regret that we inform you of the passing of your maternal uncle, Elias Thorne. As his last living blood relative, you have been designated as the sole heir and primary beneficiary of his remaining estate." Jax stared at the name until the letters began to blur. Elias Thorne. It was a name pulled from the deepest, dustiest corners of his childhood. Uncle Elias had always been the black sheep of the family, a brilliant but intensely eccentric man who had abandoned a lucrative career decades ago to retreat into the isolated wilderness of the high mountains. The family whispered that Elias had lost his mind, chasing myths and mountain legends, severing all ties with the modern world. Jax hadn't seen the man in over 25 years. He flipped to the next page, the water dripping from the brim of his cap onto the paper. The primary asset of the estate includes the property deed and surrounding acreage of Blackwood Manor, situated upon the upper ridge of Oakhaven, Colorado. Legal ownership, alongside all associated burdens and liabilities, has been transferred to your name effectively immediately. Blackwood Manor, Jax whispered aloud. The name sounded heavy, carrying the weight of forgotten centuries. Attached to the back of the legal packet were several glossy photographs. Jax pulled them loose. The images showed a monolithic, sprawling Victorian-era structure perched precariously on the edge of a jagged mountain cliff. Even in the two-dimensional photographs, the manor looked intimidating, an architectural marvel of dark, weathered timber and towering spires that seemed to aggressively pierce the sky. But it was completely desolate. The windows were hollow and dark, the massive wraparound porches sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. It looked like a place that time had not only forgotten but actively shunned. Jax flipped to the final page of the document, his eyes catching a section highlighted in bold, aggressive red ink. Notice of condemnation. Be advised that the aforementioned property is currently in severe violation of structural and municipal safety codes. The owner of record has exactly 90 days to commence comprehensive structural remediation. Failure to comply will result in the county exercising eminent domain, leading to the immediate condemnation and demolition of the property. A heavy, bitter laugh escaped Jax's lips, vaporizing into the freezing air. Of course, he muttered. He looked down at Smoky, who was sitting perfectly still, his intelligent eyes locked onto Jax's face. The dog tilted his head, listening to the tone of his master's voice. A decaying, haunted house on top of a mountain, Jax said, holding up the photo. Rotted out, falling apart at the seams. Probably carries a curse and a ghost in every room. It's worth absolutely nothing. But as he stared at the dark silhouette of Blackwood Manor, a strange, unfamiliar sensation began to take root in his chest. A roof, 4 walls, a piece of the earth that belonged to him. It didn't matter that it was broken. He was broken too. It didn't matter that it was isolated. Isolation was the only thing that brought him comfort. For the past year, the highway had been an endless purgatory, a path that led everywhere and nowhere all at once. For the first time since he had taken off his uniform, he had a destination. He had a coordinate. He reached down and firmly grasped Smoky's thick shoulders, looking the magnificent animal in the eyes. "What do you say, soldier?" Jax asked, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of life returning to his voice. "You want to trade this rusted truck for a haunted mansion?" Smoky let out a sharp, affirmative bark, his tail sweeping back and forth in a wide, eager arc. Jax folded the heavy documents, tucking them safely into the inner pocket of his jacket. He crushed his empty coffee cup and tossed it into a nearby bin. As he climbed back into the driver's seat of the truck, the rain seemed to lessen, the heavy gray clouds finally beginning to fracture, allowing a single weak beam of morning sunlight to strike the wet pavement. Jax turned the key. The old engine coughed, sputtered, and finally roared to life, vibrating with a stubborn resilience. He pulled the gear shift down and steered the truck out of the empty gas station, turning his wheels away from the endless flat plains and pointing them westward toward the towering, jagged teeth of the Rocky Mountains. He had no way of knowing that the rotting manor waiting for him was not a burden, but a fortress hiding a miraculous secret. He didn't know that the earth beneath that mountain held something so valuable that powerful, dangerous men were already scheming to steal it. And he certainly didn't know that the road to Oakhaven was about to pull him out of his trauma and throw him into a war where the stakes were higher than they had ever been. He just knew he was driving forward, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking in the rearview mirror. The highway stretched ever westward, a bruised ribbon of cracked asphalt ascending slowly but inevitably into the jagged, imposing maw of the Rocky Mountains. As the hours bled away, the flat, monotonous plains of the lower country were swallowed by rolling, shadowed foothills, which soon erupted into towering, snow-capped peaks that seemed to pierce the heavy gray underbelly of the sky. The temperature plummeted with every 100 feet of elevation gained, the air thinning out and taking on the sharp, crystalline bite of pine needles and distant glaciers. Jax Harlan kept both hands firmly on the vibrating steering wheel, listening to the agonizing, rhythmic mechanical screams of his old pickup truck as it fought against the steep incline. Beside him, Smoky sat at full attention, his large, intelligent ears swiveling like radar dishes, tracking the strange, rushing sounds of the mountain wind tearing through the dense forests of black spruce and ponderosa pine. By late afternoon, the weak sun surrendered entirely to the thickening storm clouds, casting a premature, gloomy twilight across the rugged landscape. The rusted metal sign appeared suddenly around a blind, treacherous curve, hanging by a single, groaning bolt. "Welcome to Oakhaven." Population 1,402. Someone had long ago taken a can of red spray paint and violently crossed out the number, writing not enough beneath it. As the truck rumbled over the municipal line, the town revealed itself as a haunting tableau of slow, agonizing decay. Oakhaven was a ghost town clinging desperately to its last breaths, a place where time had simply stopped moving decades ago. The main street was lined with beautiful, historic brick facades that were crumbling under the weight of neglect. Storefront windows were blind and boarded up with rotting plywood, their faded hand-painted signs advertising general stores, mining equipment, and hardware shops that had not seen a customer in a generation. A heavy, oppressive silence blanketed the empty sidewalks, broken only by the hiss of the truck's tires on the wet, freezing pavement. The few locals who were out in the cold, an older man sweeping the stoop of a defunct post office, a teenager leaning against a rusted lamppost, stopped entirely, turning their heads with slow, hollow gazes to watch the unfamiliar vehicle pass. Smoky sensed the heavy, depressive atmosphere immediately. The German shepherd shifted his weight, his muscles tensing beneath his thick coat, letting out a faint, low rumble deep within his broad chest. He scanned the dark alleyways and empty rooftops with the same hyper-vigilant intensity he once used to sweep urban combat zones for snipers. Jax reached over, resting a heavy, reassuring hand on the dog's neck. "Stand down, Smoky," Jax murmured softly, though his own eyes were scanning the environment with identical, ingrained military precision. "They're not hostiles. They're just ghosts. Same as us." Near the far edge of the hollowed-out town, Jax spotted a faint, flickering neon sign struggling against the gathering dark. Evelyn's Copper Diner. He pulled the struggling truck against the curb, killing the engine with a shuddering sigh. Stepping out into the freezing mountain draft, Jax pulled the collar of his jacket up against the wind, signaling for Smoky to follow. They walked into the diner, the door announcing them with a sharp chime. The interior was a capsule of the 1970s, cracked red leather booths, a long linoleum counter, and the heavy, comforting aroma of black coffee and cinnamon. It was entirely empty, save for a woman standing behind the counter, wiping down the surface with slow, deliberate motions. Evelyn Reed was a woman carved from the very mountain she lived on. In her late 50s, with strands of silver running through her dark hair and deep, expressive lines around her eyes that spoke of both profound grief and unbreakable resilience. She stopped wiping the counter, her sharp, observant gaze locking onto Jax, and then drifting down to the massive, heavily scarred military dog standing perfectly at his side. She didn't look afraid, she looked intensely curious. "You have the look of a man carrying entirely too many ghosts," Evelyn said, her voice surprisingly rich and smooth, carrying the warm cadence of a seasoned storyteller. "Or maybe a man coming up here to hunt for new ones." Jax offered a faint, humorless smile, taking a seat at the end of the counter. Smoky sat instantly at his left heel, a perfect disciplined guard posture. "Just passing through, looking for directions," Jax replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Need a black coffee, and whatever meat you have to spare for my partner here." Evelyn nodded, turning to the heavy coffee urn. "He's a beautiful animal. Military?" "We both were," Jax said, the words slipping out before he could catch them. He usually never volunteered that information, but there was something disarmingly honest about this woman. Evelyn set a steaming ceramic mug in front of him, followed by a thick, unseasoned beef patty on a small plate, which she set on the floor for Smoky. The dog didn't move an inch, his eyes fixed on Jax, waiting for the command. Jax gave a subtle nod, and Smoky ate the meal with swift, efficient gratitude. "Oakhaven doesn't get many tourists anymore, soldier," Evelyn said, leaning against the back counter and crossing her arms. "The mines dried up 20 years ago. The logging companies pulled out 10 years after that. Now, the only people who come up this road are the vultures looking to pick the bones clean. So, what are you looking for?" Jax reached into his jacket, pulling out the folded legal document, and laid it flat on the counter. "I'm looking for Blackwood Manor." The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. Evelyn's expression hardened, her eyes flashing with a sudden complicated mixture of sorrow and fierce protection. She stared at the paper, then back at Jax. "Elias Thorne's place. That makes you the nephew, the one who disappeared into the army." She let out a heavy, tired sigh. "Your uncle was a good man, Mr. Harlan. People around here called him crazy because he locked himself away in that colossal monstrosity on the cliff. But Elias wasn't crazy. He was just listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. He loved that mountain, and he died trying to protect it." "Protect it from what?" Jax asked, his tactical instincts flaring. Evelyn pointed a finger toward the dark window, gesturing toward the sprawling, empty town. From the men who killed Oakhaven, men who buy up starving towns for pennies on the dollar to build their private empires. That manor has been sitting empty, rotting in the wind, and the vultures have been circling it for months. You better watch your back up there. The mountain is treacherous, but the men who want it are far worse. Jax finished his coffee, leaving a crumpled $20 bill on the counter. I appreciate the warning, Evelyn, but me and Smoky, we're used to treacherous. North Road, Evelyn said softly as Jax reached the door. Follow it until the pavement dies, then take the gravel switchback straight up the cliff. And Mr. Harlan, don't let them take it from you. This town has lost enough. Jax nodded, stepping back out into the freezing twilight. He drove the truck up the North Road, the pavement quickly dissolving into deeply rutted gravel. The ascent was terrifying, the narrow road winding tightly along the edge of sheer, plunging drops into the black valley below. The pine trees closed in around them like the bars of a cage, the headlights cutting weak swaths through the dense, swirling mountain fog. Finally, the trees broke, opening onto a massive rocky plateau suspended in the sky. And there it stood, Blackwood Manor. Jax slammed on the brakes, the truck sliding slightly on the loose stone before coming to a halt. The manor was a colossal Gothic nightmare of dark, ancient timber and stone, rising 4 stories high into the weeping clouds, intricate, decaying woodwork wrapped around the massive structure like creeping vines. A sprawling wraparound veranda sagged under the weight of accumulated snow and rot, while towering chimneys reached upward like skeletal fingers. The windows were pitch black, reflecting nothing, staring down at Jax like the hollow, empty eyes of a massive sleeping beast. The sheer architectural magnitude of the place was staggering, dwarfing the man and his dog as they stepped out of the truck. The wind on the cliff face howled a mournful, relentless song, tearing at Jax's clothes. Well, Jax breathed, his voice swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. Uncle Elias certainly wasn't much for minimalism. Smoky walked forward, his nose pressed close to the frozen earth. Suddenly the dog froze, his hackles, the thick ridge of fur along his spine, rose in a jagged, aggressive line. A deep, guttural snarl vibrated from Smoky's throat, a sound Jax had not heard since they were sweeping for insurgents in a hostile compound. Jax's hand immediately dropped toward his right hip, a phantom reflex reaching for a sidearm that was no longer there. A pair of blinding, high-intensity LED headlights pierced the fog, climbing the gravel road behind them. The vehicle moved with predatory silence, the heavy crunch of tires on stone the only warning. A sleek, perfectly polished black luxury SUV rolled onto the plateau, a machine worth more than the entire town of Oakhaven combined. It came to a smooth halt 20 yards away. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out into the freezing mountain air, looking utterly disgusted by the elements around him. Silas Vance was a man who wore his power like a tailored suit. He was immaculately dressed in a dark cashmere overcoat, leather gloves, and expensive polished boots that had never touched common dirt. His face was sharp, angular, and arranged in an expression of perpetual manufactured politeness that completely failed to hide the cold, calculating void in his eyes. "Mr. Harlan, I presume," Vance called out, his voice projecting easily over the howling wind, smooth and cultured, yet carrying an undeniable edge of authority. "I am Silas Vance. I've been waiting for you." Smoky stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between Jax and the billionaire. The dog lowered his center of gravity, baring his large white canines in a terrifying display of lethal readiness. The snarl grew louder, vibrating through the ground. Vance stopped his approach, his manufactured smile tightening into a thin, annoyed line. He glanced at the dog with undisguised disdain. "You might want to leash your animal, Mr. Harlan. He seems highly unhinged." Jax didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on Vance, evaluating the man with the cold, detached calculus of a soldier assessing a threat. "He's a highly decorated combat veteran, Mr. Vance," Jax replied, his tone dangerously calm. "He only gets unhinged when he detects a threat to my life. His judgment has never been wrong." Vance forced a small patronizing chuckle, reaching into the inner breast pocket of his cashmere coat. He withdrew a crisp folded envelope, holding it between his gloved fingers. "Let us dispense with the dramatic posturing, shall we?" You are a man with no fixed address, driving a vehicle that is one breakdown away from the scrapyard, who has just inherited a condemned, rotting death trap with a 90-day demolition order hanging over its collapsed roof. Vance gestured expansively toward the monolithic ruins of Blackwood Manor. This mountain is a graveyard, and you cannot afford the burial fees. Vance took one measured step forward, extending the envelope. Inside is a certified cashier's check for $30,000. I have the transfer deeds right here in my vehicle. You sign the paper, take the money, and drive that truck back down the mountain to start a new life. You walk away, and this nightmare becomes my problem. Jax looked at the envelope. $30,000 to a man sleeping in a freezing truck, fighting off the demons of his past with nothing to his name. It was a staggering, life-altering sum. It was warmth. It was food. It was a small cabin somewhere quiet where the wars couldn't reach him. It was the easiest escape hatch in the world. But Jax Harlan hadn't survived 15 years of brutal combat by taking the easy route. His mind, honed by years of tactical analysis, began rapidly connecting the data points, the desperate dying town below. Evelyn's warning about the circling vultures, a billionaire in Kashmir driving up a treacherous dirt road to aggressively overpay for a condemned, rotting wooden box that was scheduled to be demolished by the county anyway. Men like Silas Vance didn't do favors. Men like Silas Vance didn't buy garbage unless there was gold buried beneath the trash. Smoky barked, a sharp, deafening, percussive sound that echoed off the cliffs like a gunshot. Vance flinched, physically stepping backward, his composure finally slipping to reveal a flash of genuine, ugly fear. Jax looked at the billionaire, then turned his gaze up to the towering, weather-beaten facade of the manor. He felt the cold mountain wind against his face, feeling the heavy, ancient silence of the stone beneath his boots. For the first time in years, Jax felt something foreign stirring in his chest. A sense of purpose. A hill worth holding. Jax turned back to Vance, his eyes cold and unyielding. He didn't look at the check. "I appreciate the generous welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Vance," Jax said quietly, his voice slicing cleanly through the wind. "But my uncle left this place to me, and a Harlan doesn't surrender his post on the first day." Vance slowly lowered his hand, the envelope disappearing back into his coat. The polite, manufactured smile completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, predatory malice. The billionaire stared at the broken soldier and his vicious dog, realizing that his standard tactics of financial intimidation had just failed spectacularly. "You are a severely damaged man making a catastrophic miscalculation," Vance said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silken whisper. "This mountain is unforgiving, Mr. Harlan. People who refuse to listen to reason out here tend to have terrible accidents. I highly suggest you reconsider my offer before the cold sets in." Vance turned on his heel, returning to his luxury SUV. He didn't look back as he climbed inside, the heavy door slamming shut with a solid, expensive thud. The engine hummed to life, and the vehicle slowly backed away, turning down the gravel road and disappearing into the dense, creeping fog, leaving Jax and Smoky alone on the edge of the world. The wind howled again, rattling the loose boards of the giant manor. Jax stood perfectly still, watching the road long after the taillights had faded. He reached down, burying his hand in Smoky's fur, feeling the steady, powerful heartbeat of the only family he had left. "All right, brother," Jax whispered, his jaw tightening with a newfound dangerous resolve. "Let's go see what this billionaire is so terrified of us finding." The heavy iron key, sent in the thick envelope from the Denver law firm, slid into the massive brass lock of Blackwood Manor with a harsh, grinding resistance that spoke of decades of absolute abandonment. Jax Harlan gripped the ornate, freezing metal of the handle, his muscles tensing as he threw his shoulder against the thick, weather-beaten timber of the double doors. With a violent, agonizing groan that seemed to echo across the entire mountain peak, the ancient hinges finally yielded, breaking their long, silent sleep. The heavy doors swung inward, exhaling a deep, breathless gust of stale, freezing air that smelled of dry rot, pulverized stone, and the heavy, undisturbed dust of a forgotten century. Jax stepped over the threshold, his heavy combat boots crunching softly on a floor coated in a thick, gray blanket of time. He reached to his shoulder, clicking on a high-lumen tactical flashlight. The brilliant cutting beam of white light sliced through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the grand, haunting cavern of the manor's main foyer. It was a staggering architectural marvel, a monument to a gilded age that had long since rusted away into memory. A massive, sweeping staircase constructed of carved mahogany curved upward toward a shadowy second floor, its banisters thick with intricate hand-carved vines that seemed to choke the wood. Above them, suspended from a vaulted ceiling painted with fading, peeling frescoes, hung a colossal crystal chandelier, its hundreds of glass teardrops clouded with dust and draped in heavy silver tapestries of spiderwebs. Furniture lay scattered across the vast expanse of the room, massive, looming shapes draped in yellowed linen sheets that made them look like a silent gathering of sleeping ghosts. The sheer silence of the interior was heavier than the wind outside, pressing down on Jax's eardrums with a crushing, suffocating weight. But Jax did not move like a man entering a haunted house. He moved like a soldier infiltrating a potentially hostile environment. He stepped smoothly, deliberately, his flashlight sweeping the corners, checking the lines of sight, clearing the fatal funnels of the doorways. Beside him, Smoky moved with identical, ingrained precision. The German shepherd's nose was working furiously, pulling in the complex layered scents of the ancient building, cataloging every draft, every shift in the air, every hidden shadow. The dog's padded paws made no sound on the hardwood, a phantom shadow gliding beside a broken man. They moved together through the grand parlor, into a massive cavernous dining room, where a long oak table sat waiting for guests who would never arrive, and finally toward the rear of the manor, where a long narrow hallway stretched out into absolute blackness. The cold inside the manor was different from the biting wind outside. It was a deep, damp, subterranean chill that seeped directly into the marrow of the bones, the kind of cold that gathered in places completely deprived of human warmth. Jax decided to establish a temporary perimeter in the main lobby, directly across from the grand staircase where he had a clear line of sight to the front doors and the primary hallway. He dropped his heavy canvas duffel bag onto the floor, unrolling a thick, insulated sleeping mat and a military-grade Sub-Zero sleeping bag. He poured fresh water into a collapsible canvas bowl for Smoky, who drank with measured, disciplined laps, his eyes never stopping their vigilant scan of the dark perimeter. Jax sat down on his rolled-up gear, clicking off the flashlight to conserve the battery. The sudden, total darkness was startling, but slowly, his eyes adjusted to the faint, ghostly moonlight filtering through the cracked, grime-covered windows of the foyer. Outside, the mountain storm had begun to intensify. The wind shrieked through the jagged eaves of the roof, rattling the loose wooden shutters like desperate, frantic hands trying to claw their way inside. The ancient timber of the manor groaned and settled, producing sharp, sudden cracks that sounded uncomfortably like footsteps echoing from the floors above. For a man plagued by the hyper-vigilance of post-traumatic stress, an environment like this should have been a waking nightmare, a trigger to send his nervous system into a blinding, panicked overload. But strangely, as Jax sat in the freezing, creaking darkness with his hand resting on the thick, warm fur of his dog, he felt a bizarre sense of grounding. This house was broken, abandoned, and scarred by time, much like the man sitting inside it. There were no crowds here, there was no sudden, unpredictable chaos of civilian life. There was only the honest, raw power of the mountain and the solitary ghost of his uncle Elias Thorne, who had somehow found peace in this terrifying isolation. Jax pulled the heavy canvas jacket tighter around his shoulders, his mind drifting back to the immaculately dressed billionaire who had met them on the cliff. Silas Vance was not a man who played games, nor was he a man who accepted defeat. The predatory look in Vance's eyes when Jax refused the $30,000 told him everything he needed to know. The offer had not been an act of convenience. It had been an act of desperation masked as charity. Vance wanted this land, and he wanted it immediately, before the county brought in the bulldozers. But why? The town of Oakhaven was a dead, hollow husk. There was no infrastructure, no tourism, no logical reason to build a luxury development on a cliff that was actively crumbling into the valley. Unless, Jax thought, the value wasn't in the building at all. Suddenly, Smoky stopped resting. The dog's head snapped up, his large ears rotating forward to catch a frequency that human ears could never register. The German shepherd rose to his feet in a fluid, silent motion, his body tensing into a rigid aerodynamic line of pure focus. He didn't look toward the front doors, nor did he look up the grand staircase. Instead, Smoky turned his entire attention toward the deep, narrow hallway that stretched into the back of the massive estate. Jax felt the familiar spike of adrenaline flood his bloodstream, cold and sharp. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his hand wrapping around the heavy, cold metal of the tactical flashlight. He stood up silently, nodding once to the dog. Smoky took the lead, moving with a slow, creeping gait down the dark corridor. Jax followed a step behind, keeping the beam of the flashlight pointed slightly downward to illuminate the floor without announcing their position to whatever might be waiting in the dark. They moved past doors that had swelled shut in their frames, past peeling wallpaper that hung from the walls in long, dead strips like molting skin. The air in the hallway grew noticeably colder, carrying a faint, strange scent that cut through the smell of dust, a sharp, metallic tang of wet stone and deep earth. Halfway down the corridor, Smoky stopped entirely. He lowered his massive head, pressing his nose directly against the wooden floorboards. He inhaled deeply, tracking a scent that seemed to be rising from beneath the foundation itself. Then, with a sudden, purposeful urgency, the dog began to scratch at the wood. His thick claws tore at the ancient finish, producing a harsh rhythmic scraping sound that echoed loudly through the silent manor. "What do you have, brother?" Jax whispered, crouching low beside the dog and sweeping his flashlight over the floor. At first glance, the floor looked like the rest of the hallway, wide planks of dark, age-worn oak. But as Jax brushed away a thick layer of accumulated dust and grime with his gloved hand, his tactical training allowed him to notice the discrepancy. The pattern of the wood grain was abruptly severed. The planks in this specific 3-foot rectangular section were cut cleanly, and more importantly, the heavy iron nails holding them down were completely different. The rest of the hallway utilized square-cut, blacksmith-forged nails from a century ago. The nails holding this section of the floor were modern, galvanized steel, hammered deep into the wood to hide their presence. Someone had torn up this section of the floor and resealed it, attempting to camouflage the work. Jax stood up, his mind racing. He swept his flashlight down the remainder of the hallway, spotting an open door that looked like an old maintenance closet or scullery. He moved quickly, pushing the rotting door fully open. Inside, amid collapsed shelving and rusted buckets, sat an assortment of heavy, forgotten tools. Jax grabbed a long, heavy iron pry bar, its edge chipped but still aggressively sharp, and carried it back into the hallway. Smoky stepped back, giving his handler room to work, though his eyes never left the suspicious section of the floor. Jax drove the sharp, wedged end of the heavy iron bar into the microscopic seam between the modern planks and the original oak floor. He planted his boots firmly, took a deep breath, and threw his weight backward, using the leverage of his body to force the wood upward. The manor protested loudly. The modern steel nails shrieked against the surrounding timber, a harsh, violent sound of tearing metal and splintering wood. Jax gritted his teeth, his arms burning with exertion, and pulled harder. With a final deafening crack, the first heavy plank snapped loose, flying upward in a cloud of ancient choking dust. Jax coughed, waving the dust away from his face, and jammed the pry bar under the next plank. It took him 20 agonizing minutes of brutal, sweat-soaked labor to tear up the remaining boards, tossing the splintered wood aside until the entire rectangular section was exposed. Beneath the false floor lay a heavy, solid layer of subflooring, but set dead in the center of the dark wood was a massive rusted iron ring, attached to a concealed trapdoor. Smoky leaned forward, letting out a low, vibrating growl as a draft of freezing, metallic-smelling air drifted up through the microscopic cracks around the trapdoor. Jax knelt, wrapping both hands around the freezing iron ring. He braced his boots against the surrounding floor and pulled upward with everything he had. The hidden door was incredibly heavy, built of solid core timber and lined with lead, designed to keep whatever was beneath it entirely soundproof and hidden. Slowly, with a deep, moaning creak that sounded like the earth itself tearing open, the trapdoor lifted, flipping backward to reveal a gaping, pitch-black square cut directly into the foundation of the manor. Jax clicked his flashlight to its highest setting and aimed the blinding white beam down into the hole. It was not a basement. It was a staircase, carved aggressively and violently straight down into the solid, unforgiving bedrock of the mountain. The steps were rough, uneven stone, leading down into an abyss that seemed to swallow the light entirely. The walls of the descending shaft were reinforced with massive, decaying timber supports, the unmistakable, dangerous architecture of a deep earth mining tunnel. The cold air rising from the depths was intense, but it carried that same strange, heavy metallic scent Smoky had detected. Well, Jax breathed, wiping a streak of sweat and dust from his forehead. Looks like Uncle Elias wasn't just sitting up here watching the clouds. Smoky did not hesitate. The heroic dog stepped onto the first stone stair, his claws clicking softly against the rock, leading the way into the darkness. Jax followed, ducking his head beneath the heavy wooden framing of the trapdoor, descending step by step into the freezing belly of the mountain. The deeper they went, the more the temperature dropped, until Jax could see his own breath pluming in the flashlight beam like thick, white smoke. The descent seemed to take forever, the rough stone walls pressing in close, triggering a faint, uncomfortable claustrophobia in Jax's chest, reminding him of clearing subterranean bunker complexes overseas. Finally, the stairs leveled out into a wide, low-ceilinged tunnel. Jax swept his light across the walls. Faded, decaying wooden crates were stacked against the stone, some of them shattered, their contents, rusted iron tools, coil ropes, and heavy mining picks spilling across the dirt floor. They moved down the tunnel, the silence so absolute that the sound of Jax's breathing felt deafening. At the end of the passage, the tunnel was blocked by a massive industrial iron door, the kind used to seal high-pressure environments, featuring a large, rusted wheel handle in its dead center. But Jax's attention was drawn to a small carved alcove in the stone wall just beside the heavy door. Nestled safely inside a waterproof leather satchel, coated in a thick layer of rock dust, was a thick, hand-bound journal. Jax pulled the satchel from the wall, his fingers brushing away the dust. He unbuckled the leather strap and slid the heavy book out. The cover was cracked, worn smooth by years of handling. He opened it carefully, the dry, yellowed pages crackling in the quiet tunnel. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and frantic. Property of Elias Thorne. The inside cover read. Jax turned to the first heavily inked page, shining his flashlight directly onto the fading words. October 14th. They keep sending the lawyers. They keep raising the offers. The men in the tailored suits think I am a fool, a madman clinging to a rotting house on a dead mountain. They think they can wait for me to die, wait for the county to condemn the timber, and take the land for the price of scrap. But they do not understand what I have found. The manor is merely a shield, a wooden mask hiding the true face of the earth. Jax's eyes scanned rapidly down the page, his heart beginning to beat a heavy, profound rhythm against his ribs. If my time runs out, and if the blood of my family finds this journal, heed my final warning. Do not surrender the mountain. Do not sign the papers. The true treasure of Oakhaven is not buried in the gold mines, nor is it sitting in the bank vaults of Denver. What flows beneath this heavy iron door is a miracle forged in the deep fires of the earth. It is worth more than all their corporate empires combined. They will try to take it with money, and when that fails, they will try to take it with blood. Protect the waters. Jax stared at the final sentence for a long, heavy moment. He looked up, casting his light onto the massive, rusted iron door standing silently at the end of the tunnel. Beside him, Smoky let out another low, rumbling growl, turning his head not toward the iron door, but back up the dark tunnel, toward the staircase leading to the surface. Jax immediately clicked off his flashlight, plunging them into absolute suffocating darkness. He held his breath, listening. Faintly, echoing down through the stone shaft from the manor above, came a sound that made Jax Harlan's blood run ice-cold. It was the sharp, distinct sound of shattering glass, followed by the heavy, deliberate thud of combat boots hitting the wooden floor of the grand hallway. They were no longer alone on the mountain. The darkness of the subterranean tunnel was no longer just the absence of light. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against Jax Harlan's skin, instantly charged with the electric, metallic tension of imminent violence. The distant, unmistakable shatter of glass echoing down through the stone shaft from the manor above had flipped a deep, deeply ingrained biological switch inside his mind. The hollow, aching veteran who had been shivering in a rusted truck only hours ago vanished entirely, his trauma temporarily overridden and replaced in a fraction of a second by the elite, lethal operator who had survived the most unforgiving combat theaters on the planet. His breathing slowed immediately, dropping into a shallow, measured rhythm, perfectly designed to minimize acoustic output and rapidly circulate oxygen to his muscles. Beside him, Smoky mirrored this physiological shift with terrifying perfection. The magnificent German shepherd stood frozen in the pitch-black tunnel, his massive body pulled as tight as coiled steel cable, a silent weapon waiting for the trigger to be pulled. Smoky did not bark. Military working dogs of his caliber were rigorously trained to operate in absolute silence during a stealth infiltration. He simply lowered his heavy head, his ears tracking the microscopic vibrations traveling down through the bedrock. Jax reached out in the blinding dark, his calloused hand finding the thick, coarse fur of Smoky's neck, offering 2 firm, silent taps. It was an old tactical command, one they had used in the desert when hunting high-value targets under the cover of a moonless night. It meant, hold the line. We are being hunted. Switch to predator. With the heavy, leather-bound journal of Elias Thorne safely tucked inside his jacket, Jax began the agonizingly slow ascent back up the rough-hewn stone staircase. He moved with the silent, fluid grace of a ghost returning to haunt the living, his heavy combat boots deliberately finding the extreme outer edges of the stone steps where the friction was greatest and the chance of displacing loose rock was 0. Smoky followed a single step behind, a phantom shadow gliding upward through the freezing draft. As they neared the top of the shaft, the ambient sounds of the massive, dying manor began to filter through the heavy wooden framing of the open trapdoor. The mountain storm outside was escalating into a violent tempest, hurling sheets of freezing rain against the deteriorating siding and rattling the skeletal window frames. But cutting sharply through the chaotic symphony of the storm were the sounds of deliberate, hostile human intrusion. Heavy, aggressive footsteps, the undeniable, hard-soled thud of tactical boots were moving systematically across the floorboards of the grand foyer. Jax paused 3 steps from the top, sinking into the deep shadows beneath the lip of the floor, pulling Smoky close against his leg. A sharp, brilliant beam of artificial white light suddenly swept across the ceiling of the dark hallway above them, dancing wildly through the thick clouds of disturbed dust. Check the perimeter walls, a gruff, disciplined voice commanded from the foyer, entirely devoid of the local mountain accent. It was the cold, sterile cadence of a professional corporate fixer. Vance said the old man was paranoid. The entrance won't be obvious. Look for replaced woodwork, false paneling, anything that doesn't match the original architectural blueprints. What if the vagrant is still inside? A second voice asked, this one slightly higher, carrying a nervous edge as the beam of his flashlight cut frantically into the darkness. Vance's SUV camera caught a massive dog out front. Then we put the dog down, and we dragged the vagrant out by his teeth, the first voice replied with chilling, clinical indifference. Silas Vance wants this property cleared and prepped for the demolition crews by dawn. If we have to accelerate the structural collapse with a little fire, so be it. Just find the access point before this place comes down on our heads. Jax felt a surge of cold, focused wrath spreading through his chest, a sensation he had not felt since the days of carrying a rifle across the burning sands. They were not just here to intimidate him, they were a sanctioned hit squad sent by Silas Vance to erase the legacy of Elias Thorne, to burn Blackwood Manor to the ground with Jax and Smoky inside if necessary, all to bury the miracle hidden beneath the mountain. Slowly, inch by microscopic inch, Jax pulled himself up through the trapdoor, flattening his body against the rotting, peeling wallpaper of the narrow corridor. He remained entirely outside the reach of their sweeping flashlight beams, cloaked in the pitch-black shadows that he had learned to call home. He reached down, tapping Smoky once on the shoulder, pointing a single finger toward the darkness. The dog slipped out of the hole, instantly flattening his belly against the floorboards, disappearing entirely into the gloom. Jax had no firearm. He had only his hands, his environment, and a lifetime of brutal, hand-to-hand combat training. He reached into his pocket and wrapped his fingers around the heavy, chipped iron pry bar he had used to tear open the floor. The metal was freezing, a solid, unforgiving extension of his own arm. The 2 mercenaries began moving down the hallway, their heavy boots crushing the splintered wood that Jax had discarded earlier. The nervous one was in the lead, sweeping his blinding light in wide, erratic arcs, clearly spooked by the suffocating atmosphere of the haunted manor. The leader followed a few paces behind, holding a heavy tactical crowbar in one hand and a suppressed pistol in the other. "Over here," the lead mercenary called out, his flashlight beam suddenly catching the massive, gaping square of the open trapdoor in the floor. He found it. The floor is completely torn up. There's a shaft leading straight down into the bedrock. "Keep your light steady," the leader ordered, stepping forward quickly, his boots pounding against the oak. "Is anyone down there?" Jax was positioned perfectly in the blind spot behind an open, rotting scullery door, barely 5 feet away from the men. He took a single silent breath, calculating the geometry of the narrow hallway, the trajectory of the weapons, and the physiological weak points of his targets. He had to neutralize the man with the firearm first, or both he and Smoky would be dead before they reached the end of the corridor. Jax exploded from the shadows with the terrifying kinetic velocity of a detonating artillery shell. He didn't yell. Combat had taught him that noise was a luxury you only afforded when you had already won. He closed the 5-foot gap in a fraction of a second, driving the heavy iron pry bar upward in a brutal sweeping arc. The heavy iron connected violently with the side of the leader's wrist, producing a sickening hollow crack of fracturing bone. The suppressed pistol flew from the man's paralyzed fingers, clattering harmlessly into the dark corner of the hallway. Before the mercenary could even register the agonizing pain, Jax pivoted on his heel, driving his elbow with devastating force directly into the man's sternum, sending him crashing backward into the decaying plaster wall, effectively removing him from the immediate equation. The second mercenary, panicked by the sudden violent ambush erupting from the darkness, wildly swung his high-powered flashlight like a club, dropping his other hand to his belt to draw a heavy serrated hunting knife. The blinding beam caught Jax straight in the eyes, a disorienting, burning flash that forced the veteran to raise his arm defensively, losing his tactical advantage for a crucial, split second. The mercenary lunged forward, the 6-inch steel blade slicing fiercely through the freezing air, aiming directly for Jax's exposed chest. But Silas Vance's men had made a catastrophic, fatal error. They had forgotten about the dog. A low, terrifying roar, a sound that seemed to originate from the very bowels of the mountain itself, erupted from the pitch-black shadows near the floor. Smoky launched himself like a heat-seeking missile, 100 pounds of pure, highly trained muscle and lethal intent flying through the air. The German shepherd hit the mercenary squarely in the center of his chest with the force of a speeding vehicle. The impact drove the breath from the man's lungs in a violent rush, throwing him violently backward onto the shattered floorboards. Smoky was relentless, a fury of teeth and power, pinning the man to the ground. The mercenary screamed in absolute terror, thrashing wildly in the dark, fighting blindly against an apex predator that he could barely see. In a blind, desperate panic, the man swung his arm in a wide, erratic arc, the heavy hunting knife slashing recklessly through the air as he tried to throw the massive animal off his chest. There was a sharp, terrible tearing sound, followed immediately by a high-pitched, agonizing yelp that cut straight through the noise of the storm and shattered Jax Harlan's heart into 1,000 pieces. The mercenary's blade had caught Smoky deeply across the right shoulder, slicing violently through the thick fur and deep into the muscle. The sudden, shocking pain forced the dog to recoil, his grip faltering for just a fraction of a second. It was all the opening the terrified mercenary needed. He scrambled frantically backward, kicking wildly until he found his footing on the slippery floorboards. Jax saw the flash of the bloody blade in the sweeping light of the dropped flashlight. A primal, uncontrollable rage, a wrath so profound and blinding that it entirely consumed his humanity, erupted from the deepest, darkest core of his soul. He let out a raw, deafening roar, dropping his iron bar and lunging across the hallway with bare hands. He caught the fleeing mercenary by the heavy fabric of his tactical vest, lifting the grown man entirely off his feet with a surge of impossible adrenaline-fueled strength, and slammed him brutally into the heavy solid oak frame of the nearest doorway. The man slumped instantly, his weapon clattering to the floor. The leader, clutching his shattered wrist and watching a broken veteran transform into a terrifying, unstoppable force of nature, realized the mission was a catastrophic failure. "Fall back!" the leader screamed, scrambling frantically toward the front of the manor, his heavy boots slipping on the dusty floors. The second man followed, crawling and stumbling in blind panic, bursting through the shattered window they had used to enter, throwing themselves desperately out into the violent, freezing rain of the mountain storm, choosing the wrath of the elements over the wrath of Jax Harlan. The heavy silence of Blackwood Manor slammed back into place, broken only by the wailing wind and the rhythmic, terrifying sound of heavy, labored breathing. Jax stood in the hallway, his chest heaving, his fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles were bleeding. But the rage vanished the second he heard the wet, heavy sound of blood hitting the wooden floor. Jax dropped instantly to his knees, his hands frantically searching the darkness until they found the warm, massive body of his dog. Smoky was lying on his side near the edge of the trapdoor, his breathing shallow and rapid. Jax grabbed the dropped flashlight, his hands trembling violently as he aimed the beam at his best friend. The cut was horrifying. A deep, jagged laceration ran diagonally across Smoky's powerful right shoulder. The dark crimson blood pumping steadily, soaking the thick fur and pooling rapidly on the ancient oak floorboards. Smoky looked up at Jax, his beautiful amber eyes wide and clouded with pain, letting out a soft, heartbreaking whine. "No, no, no," Jax whispered, his voice cracking, the tears he had held back for over a decade suddenly burning in his eyes. He ripped off his heavy canvas jacket, completely ignoring the freezing temperature of the manor, and tore his cotton undershirt violently from his own body. He folded the fabric into a thick pad and pressed it hard against the gaping wound, applying maximum pressure to stem the arterial flow. Smoky flinched, letting out another soft cry, but he did not pull away. The dog simply rested his heavy head on Jax's knee, trusting his handler entirely, just as he had done when the mortars were falling in the desert. "You hold on, brother. You hear me?" Jax begged, his voice trembling with a desperate, crushing fear. "You do not leave me in this dark. You hold the line." The storm outside raged on, rattling the dying bones of the manor. Jax knelt in the blood and the dust, pressing his hands against the wound of the only creature in the universe who loved him. He knew with terrifying certainty that Silas Vance would not stop. They had failed tonight, but they would return with fire, just as the mercenaries had promised. The manor was no longer a sanctuary. It was a deadly, wooden trap waiting to be ignited. Jax looked down into the black abyss of the trapdoor, feeling the strange, warm draft of metallic air rising from the depths of the earth. He remembered the final words in Elias Thorne's journal. "Protect the waters." If there was any chance of saving Smoky, any chance of surviving the wrath of a billionaire who believed he owned the world, they could not stay in the dying house. With profound, agonizing care, Jax Harlan gathered the heavy, bleeding body of his heroic dog into his arms, holding him tightly against his bare chest, and stepped entirely into the darkness of the mountain, descending toward the miraculous secret waiting far below. The descent into the absolute, suffocating darkness of the mountain was an agonizing test of physical endurance and psychological torment. Jax Harlan moved with excruciating caution down the steep, uneven stone steps of the subterranean shaft, his heavily muscled arms wrapped securely around the massive bleeding frame of his German shepherd. Smoky weighed nearly 100 pounds, a solid mass of muscle and bone that was now entirely dependent on the man who carried him. Every step Jax took sent a sharp, vibrating ache through his own battered spine, his combat boots scraping blindly against the rough-hewn rock as he navigated the pitch-black abyss. He had tucked the tactical flashlight into the crook of his neck, its brilliant white beam bouncing erratically off the narrow, claustrophobic walls of the tunnel, casting long, monstrous shadows that seemed to dance and twist in the periphery of his vision. The air grew noticeably heavier, the deeper they traveled into the bedrock. The biting, freezing draft of the mountain storm raging far above them was slowly replaced by a strange, dense humidity that carried the sharp, metallic tang of iron, sulfur, and ancient earth. Jax could feel the warm, wet stickiness of Smoky's blood soaking through the makeshift bandage, staining his bare chest and arms. The dog's breathing was shallow and rapid, a series of short, pained exhales that cut through the absolute silence of the deep earth like a serrated blade. "Just hold on, brother," Jax whispered, his voice echoing hollowly down the stone corridor. "We are almost there. Just stay with me." Smoky let out a soft, barely audible whine, pressing his heavy head against Jax's collarbone, a profound gesture of absolute, unyielding trust. Even in his agony, the heroic war dog sought to comfort his handler, recognizing the raw, terrifying panic vibrating through Jax's racing heart. Finally, the grueling staircase ended, opening into the wide, low-ceilinged mining tunnel Jax had discovered earlier. He moved quickly past the decaying wooden crates and discarded tools, his singular focus locked onto the massive industrial iron door, standing silently at the end of the passage. When he reached the rusted barricade, Jax gently lowered Smoky to the cold dirt floor, resting the dog against a relatively smooth section of the stone wall. He pulled the blood-soaked cotton shirt tighter around the dog's shoulder, applying one last surge of heavy pressure before turning his attention entirely to the massive iron wheel set dead in the center of the door. Jax grabbed the freezing iron wheel with both hands, planting his heavy boots firmly into the dirt. He squeezed his eyes shut, calling upon every ounce of adrenaline and desperate strength remaining in his exhausted body, and twisted. The ancient locking mechanism resisted violently, groaning with decades of undisturbed rust and immense subterranean pressure. The veins in Jax's neck bulged, his muscles screaming in protest as he threw his entire body weight into the rotation. With a sudden deafening crack that sounded like a rifle shot echoing through the confined space, the seal finally broke. The heavy wheel spun and the massive iron door groaned outward on its colossal hinges. The moment the door cracked open, Jax was hit by a rushing, invisible wave of thick, surprisingly warm air. It washed over his freezing bare skin like a heavy blanket, carrying an incredibly rich, complex aroma that completely erased the scent of dust and decay. It smelled like crushed pine needles after a heavy spring rain, mixed with the pure, clean scent of ozone and deep mineral earth. Jax pushed the heavy door fully open and stepped over the threshold, retrieving his flashlight and sweeping the beam into the unknown darkness. What he saw stopped the breath completely in his lungs. Beyond the rusted iron door lay a colossal, breathtaking underground cavern, a natural architectural masterpiece carved by the slow, patient hands of the earth over millions of years. The vaulted ceiling arched nearly 50 feet above them, draped with magnificent jagged stalactites that glittered like massive suspended diamonds in the beam of his light. The walls of the cavern were streaked with brilliant, swirling veins of pale white, deep turquoise, and rich copper minerals, creating a mesmerizing tapestry of geological history. But the true miracle of the cavern lay spread across the sprawling stone floor. A massive, perfectly clear body of water stretched deep into the shadows, an ancient subterranean lake fed by a steady, rushing stream pouring from a deep fissure in the back wall. The water was not stagnant. It was vibrantly alive, bubbling gently near the center where thermal heat from the Earth's mantle rose to the surface. A thick, mesmerizing layer of white steam drifted lazily across the surface of the pool, curling into the air and warming the entire cavern to a comfortable, deeply soothing temperature. Jax stood entirely frozen, utterly captivated by the overwhelming, primordial beauty of the sanctuary his uncle had protected. He had spent his entire adult life navigating landscapes completely destroyed by human violence, walking through shattered cities and burning deserts. He had forgotten that the world was capable of harboring such profound, untouched peace. A soft whimper brought his mind crashing instantly back to reality. Jax dropped his flashlight, leaving it resting on a flat stone to illuminate the edge of the water, and rushed back to Smoky. He lifted the heavy, bleeding dog once more, carrying him carefully over the smooth, water-worn stones until they reached the edge of the steaming mineral pool. Jax knelt beside the water, the warm steam enveloping his face, and gently laid Smoky down on a flat, smooth slab of copper-veined rock. He peeled away the blood-soaked cotton shirt from the dog's shoulder, his heart clenching at the sight of the deep, angry laceration left by the mercenary's blade. Without hesitation, Jax cupped his hands, dipping them into the crystal-clear pool. The water was remarkably warm, carrying a smooth, almost silky texture. He brought his cupped hands up and gently, methodically began to wash the dark blood away from Smoky's wound. The dog tensed slightly at the first touch, but as the warm, mineral-rich water cascaded over his torn flesh, something miraculous began to happen. Smoky's rigid muscles visibly relaxed. The rapid, panicked rhythm of his breathing began to slow, settling into a deep, steady cadence. Jax continued to bathe the wound, watching in absolute disbelief as the heavy bleeding slowed to a crawl, the sheer concentration of natural elements in the water acting as an immediate, powerful coagulant. The deep laceration was entirely cleaned, the skin around it losing its angry, inflamed redness. Smoky let out a long, heavy sigh, lowering his massive head to rest completely flat against the warm stone. His amber eyes, previously clouded with sharp pain and exhaustion, cleared beautifully. He looked at Jax, offering a single, slow blink of profound gratitude before closing his eyes and drifting into a deep, restorative sleep. Jax sat back on his heels, his hands resting on his knees, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotional relief. He reached out, his trembling fingers gently stroking the soft fur behind the sleeping dog's ears. "You're going to be okay," Jax whispered, a single tear escaping the corner of his eye and tracing a clean line through the dust on his cheek. "We are going to be okay." For a long time, the only sound in the massive cavern was the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the warm water against the stone and the steady, peaceful breathing of the heroic dog. Jax sat in the quiet warmth, letting the tension of the violent ambush slowly drain from his exhausted muscles. After ensuring Smoky was completely stable and resting deeply, Jax reached into the inner pocket of his discarded jacket and pulled out the heavy leather-bound journal he had taken from the tunnel wall. He moved closer to the beam of the flashlight, carefully opening the brittle, yellowed pages, searching for the truth behind the miracle he was sitting beside. Elias Thorne had not just been an eccentric recluse. He had been a meticulous, brilliant scholar of geology and local history. The journal was filled with detailed hand-drawn maps of the subterranean water tables, chemical breakdowns of mineral deposits, and transcriptions of oral histories passed down by the indigenous tribes who had originally inhabited the Oakhaven Valley centuries before the mining companies arrived. Jax read the beautiful, sweeping handwriting with growing fascination. They called it the Tear of the Mountain. Elias had written, long before the brick facades of Oakhaven were built, the native elders spoke of a hidden, boiling spring deep within the rock that possessed the power to knit broken flesh and calm a warring mind. When I first discovered the cavern behind the old mining shafts, I believed it was merely a fairy tale. But the water is no myth. It is a geological anomaly of staggering proportions. I have sent blind samples to the most advanced laboratories across the continent. The results are undeniable. The water flowing into this cavern contains an unprecedented, perfectly balanced concentration of natural lithium, magnesium, zinc, and rare sulfur compounds. It is a naturally occurring therapeutic serum completely unpolluted by the modern world. Jax turned the page, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping into place as he read his uncle's final, desperate entries. Silas Vance does not want to build a simple mountain resort. He has acquired the geological surveys. He knows what lies beneath my home. If Vance takes Blackwood Manor, he will bring in the heavy excavators. He will blast open the cavern, completely destroying the delicate pressure systems of the mountain, all to drain the spring into a massive, sterilized commercial bottling facility. He will package the healing waters of Oakhaven and sell them to the highest bidders in the glass towers of the cities. He will kill the mountain, and he will ensure that the dying town below never sees a single drop of the prosperity that rightfully belongs to them. The water is a gift to the broken, not a commodity for the greedy. I have locked the doors. I have hidden the path. I only pray that whoever inherits this burden has the strength to stand against the storm. Jax slowly closed the heavy leather cover of the journal, the weight of the book feeling profound in his hands. He looked up, his eyes sweeping across the massive, glittering cavern, taking in the warm, rising steam and the deep, silent power of the ancient earth. He looked at Smoky, sleeping peacefully on the warm stone, saved by the very waters Elias Thorne had died trying to protect. The hollow, aching emptiness that had plagued Jax Harlan for years. The feeling that he was a soldier without a mission, a guardian without a flock, completely vanished in the humid air of the cavern. Silas Vance was a vulture who thrived on the despair of others, a man who believed that everything in the world, including history and healing, had a price tag. Vance had sent armed men into Jax's home. He had drawn the blood of a heroic dog who had survived the worst wars of a generation. Jax stood up slowly, the muscles in his back and shoulders tightening with a terrifying, unyielding resolve. The trauma of his past no longer felt like a heavy chain dragging him into the dark. It felt like a forged, tempered armor. He walked to the edge of the steaming pool and submerged his own battered, bruised arms into the water, feeling the immediate soothing warmth seep deeply into his aching joints. He was Jax Harlan. He was a survivor of the unforgiving desert, the keeper of Blackwood Manor, and the protector of the Oakhaven Spring. Silas Vance wanted a war for the mountain, believing he was dealing with a broken, defenseless vagrant. Let the billionaire come, Jax thought, staring into the dark tunnel that led back to the surface. Let him bring his corporate fixers and his heavy machinery. The battle lines had been drawn in the stone, and Jax was no longer running. He would hold this ground until his dying breath. But as Jax stood in the peaceful warmth of the hidden cavern, a faint, deeply unsettling scent suddenly drifted down through the cold draft of the open trapdoor far above them. It cut through the clean smell of ozone and minerals, sharp and acrid, triggering an immediate, primal alarm in Jax's mind. It was the unmistakable, terrifying scent of burning wood and chemical accelerant. Vance's men had not simply retreated from the mountain. They had sealed the doors, poured the gasoline, and struck the match. Above them, Blackwood Manor was igniting into a colossal, roaring inferno. The acrid, chemical stench of modern accelerant cut violently through the pristine ancient air of the subterranean sanctuary, entirely shattering the profound peace of the cavern. It was a sharp, poisonous odor, gasoline mixed with the decaying, century-old timber of Blackwood Manor, and it was being pulled down the stone shaft by the massive changing atmospheric pressure above. Jax Harlan's head snapped upward, his eyes locking onto the dark tunnel that led back to the heavy iron door. In the military, Jax had been trained to instantly recognize the various distinct personalities of fire. There was the slow, smoldering burn of a localized structural incident, and then there was the catastrophic roaring inferno of a deliberate, coordinated arson. The low, vibrating rumble that was currently shuddering down through the bedrock belonged exclusively to the latter. Silas Vance had not simply ordered his mercenaries to intimidate a stubborn veteran. He had commanded them to utterly erase the property from the face of the mountain. Fire is a living, breathing, voracious entity, and to sustain its terrible life, it requires an immense, continuous supply of oxygen. Blackwood Manor, constructed of dry, incredibly old wood and completely exposed to the howling winds of the high-altitude storm, was essentially a colossal 5-story tinderbox waiting for a single spark. The moment the gasoline ignited in the grand foyer, the massive structure began to consume the surrounding air with a terrifying, insatiable appetite. The deep stone staircase leading down to the hidden cavern, which had previously served as a secret passageway, was rapidly transforming into a subterranean chimney, pulling the breathable air violently upward to feed the flames. Jax spun around, rushing back to the edge of the steaming mineral pool. Smoky was already awake, his powerful survival instincts overriding the deep restorative sleep. The German shepherd stood up, favoring his injured right shoulder, but bearing his weight with a renewed, astonishing resilience. The coagulating properties of the geothermal spring had worked a minor miracle on the torn flesh, closing the laceration and stopping the hemorrhage. But the dog was still exhausted, his thick coat matted with dried blood and mineral water. Smoky let out a low, anxious whine, his amber eyes fixed entirely on the dark ceiling of the cavern as the deep, seismic rumbling of the burning manor above grew exponentially louder. "I know, brother, I know," Jax said, his voice completely stripped of panic, replaced by the icy, calculated calm of a seasoned operator facing an overwhelming tactical disadvantage. "We cannot go back up. The iron door might hold the flames, but the carbon monoxide will fill the shaft and suffocate us before the roof even collapses. We have to push deeper into the dark." Before abandoning the sanctuary, the analytical, strategic side of Jax's brain engaged with a sudden, brilliant clarity. Silas Vance was burning Blackwood Manor to definitively solve a legal problem. Once the historic structure was reduced to a pile of smoldering ash, the county would immediately move forward with the condemnation and demolition orders, effectively handing the cleared, prepped land over to Vance's corporate development firm for pennies. Without the physical manor standing to block the legal proceedings, Jax's claim to the property would be buried under a mountain of expensive litigation he could never afford. If he was going to survive this night and expose the billionaire's ruthless corruption, he needed something far more powerful than a dead man's journal. He needed undeniable, scientific proof of the miracle Silas Vance was trying to steal. Jax unclipped the heavy military-grade aluminum canteen from his tactical belt. He knelt at the very source of the spring, where the hot, mineral-rich water poured directly from a deep, jagged fissure in the subterranean bedrock. He submerged the canteen, allowing the heavy, metallic-smelling water to fill the container completely, sealing it tight with the heavy rubber gasket. This single liter of water was no longer just a provision for survival. It was the ultimate weapon in a war that had just turned violently lethal. He secured the canteen back to his belt, tucked Elias Thorne's leather-bound journal safely into the waterproof lining of his bag, and grabbed his high-lumen tactical flashlight. "Let's move, Smoky," Jax commanded softly, sweeping the brilliant white beam across the vast, shadowed expanse of the cavern. If a subterranean spring flowed into the cavern, logic dictated that the water had to flow out. Millions of gallons of water could not simply exist in a closed stone basin without eventually carving an exit path through the mountain. Jax tracked the slow, gentle current of the steaming pool toward the far, lightless back wall of the cavern. There, completely hidden behind a massive, sloping curtain of glittering stalactites, the water narrowed into a rushing, shallow stream that disappeared into a jagged, incredibly tight horizontal fissure in the solid rock. It was a claustrophobic nightmare. The opening was barely 3 feet high and perhaps 2 feet wide, a completely lightless throat of jagged stone that looked as though it could crush a man simply by shifting its immense weight. A freezing, violent draft of air rushed through the narrow gap, colliding with the warm steam of the cavern. That freezing wind was the most beautiful thing Jax had ever felt. It meant the tunnel eventually breached the surface of the mountain. It was their only exit. "Stay close to my heels," Jax instructed the dog. He dropped down onto his hands and knees, the cold, shallow water soaking immediately through his denim jeans, and crawled into the crushing darkness of the fissure. The physical toll of the escape was immediate and agonizing. The walls of the escape tunnel were completely unyielding, covered in sharp, abrasive ridges of raw granite that tore mercilessly at Jax's bare shoulders and back. He was forced to contort his heavy, muscular frame, sliding sideways through sections where the rock squeezed inward like the jaws of a massive vice. He held the flashlight in his mouth, the beam cutting wildly through the gloom, illuminating nothing but endless damp stone. Directly behind him, Smoky moved with extraordinary bravery. The tight, confined space was terrifying for an animal, but the German shepherd followed his handler without a single sound of protest, his wet paws splashing softly in the shallow stream, trusting the man entirely to lead them out of the grave. As they pushed deeper into the mountain, the space grew even tighter. The ceiling dipped so low that Jax was forced to slide on his stomach. His face mere inches from the rushing water, the absolute lack of space, the crushing weight of the earth pressing down on his spine, and the absolute darkness violently triggered the deeply buried psychological landmines of his post-traumatic stress. Suddenly, the wet stone walls of the Colorado mountain vanished, replaced by the suffocating burning heat of a collapsed concrete bunker in a war zone far away. His breathing hitched, becoming shallow and rapid. A cold, blinding panic began to seize his chest, his muscles completely locking up as the terrifying illusion of being buried alive threatened to completely break his mind. He stopped moving, his eyes wide and unseeing in the dark, his hands gripping the wet rock with desperate white-knuckled terror. A warm, wet nose pressed firmly against the sole of his combat boot. Smoky let out a soft, low, and incredibly steady whine. The physical contact acted as a lightning rod, instantly grounding the electrical storm of panic raging inside Jax's brain. The dog, despite his own injuries and the terrifying environment, was performing his duty perfectly, anchoring his handler to the present reality. Jax squeezed his eyes shut, forcing a massive, deep breath into his burning lungs. He was not in the desert, he was not buried under artillery rubble. He was Jax Harlan, and his partner needed him to keep moving. "Good boy!" Jax gasped, the words echoing hollowly in the tight stone pipe. "I'm with you. I'm right here." He dug his elbows into the wet gravel and pulled himself forward with renewed, desperate strength. They crawled for what felt like hours, entirely separated from the concept of time, existing only in a torturous cycle of reaching, pulling, and breathing. Suddenly, a massive, catastrophic shockwave violently shook the entire mountain. The deep, heavy bedrock beneath them vibrated with a terrifying, sustained rumble, followed by a deafening, thunderous roar that echoed down the tunnel like the detonation of a massive explosive charge. Dust and small fragments of rock rained down from the low ceiling, splashing into the water around them. Blackwood Manor had finally surrendered to the inferno. The massive, four-story wooden structure, weakened by decades of rot and consumed entirely by the intense heat of the chemical fire, had collapsed in upon itself. Thousands of tons of burning timber, brick chimneys, and heavy slate roofing had crashed down into the foundation, effectively burying the hidden trapdoor and sealing the subterranean staircase forever. Silas Vance had gotten exactly what he wanted. He had completely erased the history of the mountain, believing he had buried the troublesome veteran and his dog in the ashes of the ruined estate. The realization that they were now entirely cut off from the world above injected a final surge of adrenaline into Jax's exhausted bloodstream. The tunnel slowly began to slope upward, the shallow stream fighting against the incline. The crushing walls gradually widened, allowing Jax to finally push himself up onto his hands and knees, and then, miraculously, onto his feet. The air rushing against his face was no longer just a draft, it was the full, freezing, chaotic fury of the mountain storm. Jax stumbled forward, his boots slipping on the wet, moss-covered stone, until he burst through a heavy curtain of thick, hanging pine boughs and collapsed onto the soft, snow-covered earth of the high alpine ridge. Smoky emerged a second later, shaking the freezing water from his thick coat with a violent shudder before stepping protectively in front of Jax, his eyes scanning the dark, howling forest for threats. They had survived. They had crawled through the lightless throat of the earth and emerged on the far northern face of the mountain, nearly half a mile away from the plateau where the manor had stood. Jax rolled onto his back, his chest heaving as he stared up at the swirling, snow-filled sky. He was freezing, completely soaked in glacial water, his skin covered in deep abrasions and dirt. But he felt more vibrantly alive than he had in a decade. He slowly pushed himself to his feet, resting his hand heavily on Smoky's head, and walked to the edge of the high ridge, looking back across the deep, black expanse of the valley. In the distance, perched on the edge of the opposite cliff, a towering, apocalyptic pillar of orange and crimson fire roared into the night sky. The flames leaped hundreds of feet into the air, casting a brilliant, terrifying glow across the falling snow and illuminating the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountains. It was a funeral pyre of staggering proportions, completely visible to the entire sleeping town of Oakhaven far below in the valley. Silas Vance had intended the fire to be a quiet, efficient assassination, an invisible erasure of his obstacles. But in his desperate, arrogant greed, the billionaire had made a catastrophic tactical miscalculation. By burning the colossal structure of Blackwood Manor, he had not hidden his crimes. He had lit a massive, unmistakable signal beacon for the entire world to see. Jax stood on the freezing ridge, watching the embers spiral into the heavens, his hand resting securely on the military canteen strapped to his belt. The heavy, mineral-rich water inside it felt like a locked and loaded weapon. He reached down, patting the strong, unyielding shoulder of his heroic dog. "He thinks he won the war because he burned down the fortress, Smoky," Jax whispered, his voice as cold and sharp as the mountain wind. "But he doesn't know that we made it out. And he definitely doesn't know what we brought with us. It's time to go to the city." The biting glacial wind tearing across the northern face of the mountain carried the faint, bitter scent of the distant inferno, a grim reminder of the colossal destruction occurring just over the jagged ridge. Jax Harlan and his heavily scarred, fiercely loyal German shepherd began the agonizingly slow, treacherous descent down the sheer, snow-covered slope, moving through a landscape that was entirely hostile to human survival. The darkness under the thick canopy of the ancient black spruce trees was absolute, broken only by the weak, erratic beam of Jax's dying tactical flashlight. Every step was a calculated risk. The loose shale and hidden, ice-covered roots threatened to shatter an ankle or send them plunging violently into the deep ravines below. But Jax moved with the relentless, unyielding determination of a phantom, his combat boots finding traction where there seemed to be none, his body operating entirely on the volatile fuel of raw adrenaline and righteous, focused fury. Smoky stayed practically glued to Jax's left thigh, navigating the perilous terrain with a silent, stoic grace that defied his recent agonizing injury. The miraculous coagulating properties of the geothermal spring water had firmly sealed the deep laceration across the dog's powerful shoulder, but the physical toll of the violent ambush and the claustrophobic subterranean escape was etched into every heavy, measured step the animal took. Jax frequently paused in the freezing darkness, dropping to one knee in the deep snow to run his bare, freezing hands over Smoky's head and neck, offering silent, physical reassurance. They were two old soldiers walking through the valley of the shadow of death, relying entirely on the unbreakable, unspoken bond they had forged in the blood and dust of a forgotten war. It took them nearly 3 agonizing hours to navigate the treacherous back trails and finally reach the desolate, gravel access road where Jax had wisely parked his battered pickup truck. The vehicle was completely cloaked in the heavy shadows of the tree line, utterly invisible from the main road leading up to the burning ruins of Blackwood Manor. Jax leaned heavily against the rusted quarter panel of the truck, his chest heaving with exhaustion, and allowed himself a single, deep breath of relief. He opened the passenger door, gently assisting Smoky onto the worn bench seat, before climbing into the driver's side and sliding the heavy iron key into the ignition. The old engine turned over with a harsh, protesting whine, coughing violently before finally settling into a loud, uneven rumble. Jax immediately cranked the faulty heater to its maximum setting, though it only managed to blow a tepid, anemic breath of stale air into the freezing cabin. He sat in the dark for a moment, his hands gripping the freezing steering wheel, and looked through the windshield toward the distant peak of the mountain. The apocalyptic glow of Silas Vance's fire still painted the low-hanging storm clouds in violent shades of crimson and bruised purple. Vance's private mercenaries were undoubtedly swarming the perimeter of the collapsed manor right now, securing the ashes and preparing the final fabricated reports that would declare the dangerous property entirely destroyed by a tragic, accidental structural fire. Jax slammed the heavy gearshift into drive. He kept the headlights completely off, relying entirely on the ghostly ambient light of the moon reflecting off the snow to navigate the winding, treacherous mountain road. He drove with the stealth and paranoia of an operator deep behind enemy lines, constantly checking the cracked rearview mirror, watching for the telltale sweep of high-intensity headlights that would signal an approaching corporate hit squad. It was not until they had descended past the hollowed-out sleeping town of Oakhaven and merged onto the desolate two-lane state highway that Jax finally reached out and switched his headlights on. The long, hypnotic drive through the absolute darkness of the Colorado wilderness slowly gave way to the sprawling artificial light pollution of the approaching metropolitan grid. By 3 a.m, the battered pickup truck merged onto the massive, multi-lane interstate that cut directly into the sleeping heart of Denver. The transition from the raw, untamed violence of the freezing mountain to the sterile concrete geometry of the city was jarring. Towering skyscrapers of glass and steel loomed against the night sky, monuments to the very corporate empires that men like Silas Vance used to crush forgotten towns like Oakhaven into the dirt. Jax navigated the empty city streets with singular, unwavering purpose, finally pulling the truck against the curb outside a massive, brutalist concrete building that housed the Colorado Geological Institute. The facility appeared completely dark and abandoned at this hour, save for a single warm square of fluorescent light glowing softly from a ground-floor laboratory window. Jax unclipped the heavy military canteen from his belt, feeling the immense, undeniable weight of the ancient water sloshing inside. He looked at Smoky, who was resting his head on his paws, his amber eyes watching his handler with quiet trust. "You stay here and rest, brother," Jax commanded softly, cracking the windows slightly to allow the freezing city air to circulate. "Keep your eyes open." Jax stepped out of the truck, the freezing wind whipping down the empty concrete canyon of the street, and walked purposefully toward the heavy glass doors of the Institute. He pressed the after-hours intercom button, holding his thumb against the cold plastic until a sharp, static-filled voice crackled through the speaker. "The Institute is closed until 8 a.m, the voice stated, carrying the heavy, exhausted cadence of someone who had been staring at microscopic slides for far too long. "I have an emergency geological sample from a highly disputed, unmapped subterranean thermal source," Jax replied, his voice projecting the absolute, unquestionable authority of a commanding officer. "It requires immediate, blind chemical analysis." There was a long, heavy silence from the speaker, followed by the loud, mechanical buzz of the electronic deadbolt disengaging. Jax pushed through the heavy glass doors, stepping into a sterile, brightly lit lobby that smelled sharply of industrial bleach and oxidized metal. He followed the signs down a long white corridor until he reached the open doorway of the active laboratory. Dr. Aris Mercer was a man who looked as though he had not seen natural sunlight in a decade. He was remarkably thin, with deep purple hollows under his sharp, intelligent eyes, and silver hair that stood up in erratic tufts. He wore a stained white lab coat over a faded band T-shirt, and he was currently leaning over a complex array of glass beakers and digital mass spectrometers. Mercer looked up as Jax entered, his eyes immediately scanning the heavily bruised, dirt-covered veteran who looked like he had just walked out of an active war zone. "You look like you fell off a mountain," Mercer stated flatly, adjusting his thick, wire-rimmed glasses. "I crawled out from under one," Jax replied. He walked directly to the stainless steel examination table and placed the heavy military canteen down with a solid metallic thud. "I need a comprehensive breakdown of everything suspended in this liquid. Trace minerals, elemental concentrations, biological contaminants, everything." Mercer sighed, a long, weary sound, and picked up the canteen. "People drag water down from the mountains all the time, my friend. They think they found the fountain of youth in some muddy creek, and it usually turns out to be concentrated agricultural runoff. This kind of expedited late-night analysis is incredibly expensive." Jax reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled, blood-stained $30,000 cashier's check that Silas Vance had attempted to bribe him with earlier that day. He slapped the expensive paper down onto the steel table right next to the canteen. "Bill me," Jax said coldly. Mercer looked at the staggering amount written on the check, then looked back at Jax's hardened, unyielding expression. The scientist's cynical demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, focused curiosity of a brilliant academic who realized he was standing on the edge of something dangerous. He unscrewed the heavy cap of the canteen, immediately bringing the opening close to his nose. Mercer frowned, deeply intrigued by the sharp, incredibly clean scent of ozone and sulfur that drifted from the dark container. "Give me 40 minutes, Mercer said, turning away and immediately pouring the ancient spring water into a series of sterilized glass vials. Jax did not sit down. He paced the length of the sterile laboratory, the rhythmic, heavy thud of his combat boots echoing off the tiled walls. His mind was a complex tactical map, constantly calculating Silas Vance's potential movements, analyzing the timeline of the fire, and preparing for the inevitable, violent retaliation that would follow the revelation of the truth. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. Finally, the high-speed printers in the corner of the laboratory sprang to life, spitting out pages of complex data graphs and chemical breakdowns. Dr. Mercer gathered the papers, his eyes scanning the numbers with rapidly growing disbelief. He read the results, pulled off his glasses, rubbed his exhausted eyes, and then read the results a second time. The color completely drained from the scientist's face. "Where exactly did you say you sourced this water?" Mercer asked, his voice suddenly dropping to a hushed, reverent whisper. "A deep subterranean aquifer beneath Oakhaven," Jax replied, stepping closer to the steel table. "What does the paper say, Doctor?" Mercer laid the printed reports down, his hands trembling slightly. "It says that you are either a brilliant fabricator or you have stumbled upon the most significant geothermal anomaly discovered in North America in the last century." He pointed a shaking finger at a violently spiking graph on the page. "This liquid contains a concentration of naturally occurring lithium, magnesium, and incredibly rare, highly stable zinc compounds that defy standard geological models. The elemental balance is practically therapeutic grade straight out of the earth. If this source is sustainable, the raw, unrefined water alone is a medical and commercial goldmine." Jax crossed his heavy arms, his jaw tightening. "How much is a gold mine worth?" Mercer looked up, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "If you own the land sitting on top of this aquifer, and the volume is as massive as you claim, the property rights are easily worth upwards of $300 million. Perhaps more if the pharmaceutical and luxury wellness corporations start a bidding war." The staggering, incomprehensible number hung in the sterile, fluorescent air of the laboratory like a physical entity. $300 million. Jax finally understood the absolute ruthless totality of Silas Vance's greed. Vance was not simply trying to steal a rotting house on a cliff, he was trying to steal a miracle that could fund an empire. Vance was willing to murder a veteran, slaughter a heroic dog, and burn a mountain to ash to ensure that he alone controlled the tear of the mountain. Jax reached out, taking the official, stamped laboratory reports from the table, carefully folding the undeniable proof of the spring's existence into the pocket of his jacket. "Thank you, Doctor," Jax said quietly. "You just gave me the ammunition I need." He turned and walked rapidly out of the laboratory, pushing through the heavy glass doors of the institute and stepping back out into the freezing city night. He walked toward his battered pickup truck, his eyes instinctively sweeping the dark, empty street to check the perimeter. And then, Jax froze. Parked exactly 1 block away, idling silently in the deep, heavy shadow of a broken streetlight, was a sleek, perfectly polished black luxury SUV. The engine was running, the dark-tinted windows entirely impenetrable. Silas Vance was a billionaire with endless resources, capable of tracking a cellular signal, a license plate, or a credit card across the state in a matter of minutes. Vance's private army had not perished on the mountain. They had followed the ghost down into the city. Jax looked at the printed lab reports in his pocket, then looked at the black SUV waiting patiently in the dark. A cold, terrifying realization washed over him. He was a single, exhausted soldier, armed with a piece of paper, entirely outgunned and outmaneuvered in the shadows by a corporation that practically owned the city. If he tried to drive back to the mountain now, Vance's men would simply run his truck off the road, execute him and his dog in the dirt, and burn the laboratory reports. He could not fight a billionaire in the dark. If Silas Vance wanted to operate in the shadows, Jax Harlan was going to drag him violently, kicking and screaming into the blinding, unforgiving light. Jax climbed into the cab of the truck, Smoky instantly sitting up at attention. Jax slammed the vehicle into gear, ignoring the black SUV completely. He did not turn toward the highway leading back to the isolated mountains. Instead, he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes burning with absolute, unstoppable resolve, and drove the rusted truck straight toward the towering, illuminated broadcast antennas of the largest television news network in Denver. The towering glass facade of the Denver Metropolitan News Broadcasting Center stood like a modern fortress against the fading night, a monolithic structure of steel and satellite dishes that pulsed with the ceaseless, frantic energy of the 24-hour news cycle. Jax Harlan parked his battered pickup truck directly beneath the glaring security lights of the main entrance, deliberately placing his vehicle in the most visible, undeniable location possible. He stepped out into the freezing city air, his heavy combat boots hitting the concrete with the absolute, unyielding certainty of a man who had finally stopped running. Beside him, Smoky descended from the cab with a quiet, watchful dignity, the German shepherd's thick coat still holding the faint scent of the mountain storm and the deep earth. Together, the battle-scarred veteran and the heroic war dog walked through the sliding glass doors and into the blinding, sterile fluorescence of the station lobby. The young security guard behind the reception desk immediately stood up, his hand hovering nervously near the radio on his belt, entirely unprepared for the sight of a heavily bruised man, covered in dirt, dried blood, and mountain ash, flanked by a massive, highly trained canine. But Jax did not falter, nor did he raise his voice. He simply walked to the desk, pulled the heavy, stamped geological laboratory reports from his jacket, and laid them flat on the polished marble counter. "My name is Jax Harlan," he said, his voice carrying the deep, resonant calm of the eye of a hurricane. "I am the sole legal owner of Blackwood Manor in Oakhaven. Less than 4 hours ago, a corporate development firm led by Silas Vance deliberately burned my historic property to the ground in an attempt to bury a naturally occurring geothermal mineral spring worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I have the irrefutable scientific proof of the water's chemical composition. I have the surviving journals of the estate's original owner, and I have the scars from the armed mercenaries Vance sent to silence me. Call your producers right now." Within 30 minutes, the sterile silence of the early morning lobby had transformed into a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, shouting producers, and the frantic shuffling of camera crews. The news director, a sharp-eyed veteran journalist who immediately recognized the explosive, unprecedented magnitude of the story, pulled Jax and Smoky directly into the primary broadcast studio. They did not have time for makeup or polished suits. Jax sat beneath the blinding, high-intensity studio lights in his torn, ash-stained canvas jacket, looking exactly like what he was, a survivor who had crawled out of the ashes of a billionaire's greed. Smoky sat perfectly composed at his handler's feet, a silent, magnificent testament to loyalty and survival. As the digital clock struck 5 in the morning, the red recording light atop the primary camera flared to life. The broadcast was pushed out live, interrupting the standard morning programming across the entire state of Colorado. Jax looked directly into the camera lens, his eyes utterly devoid of fear. He did not yell. He did not posture. He spoke with the quiet, devastating power of absolute truth. He detailed the long-forgotten history of Elias Thorne, the terrifying claustrophobic ambush in the dark, and the brutal blade that had struck his faithful dog. He laid the geological reports on the news desk, completely exposing the staggering $300 million valuation of the thermal spring. And then, he looked straight through the TV screens, speaking directly to the man who was undoubtedly watching from his penthouse fortress. Silas Vance believed that because Oakhaven is a forgotten town, its people are defenseless, Jax said, his voice echoing across living rooms and coffee shops throughout the state. He believed that he could burn a mountain to the ground and steal its miracles in the dark, simply because he has enough money to bury the truth. But this mountain does not belong to the billionaires. It belongs to the people who stayed when the mines closed. It belongs to the people who refused to let their home die. Vance thought the fire would erase us, but all he did was show the entire world exactly where to look. By the time the sun fully breached the horizon, casting a brilliant, piercing gold across the jagged spine of the Rocky Mountains, the world had fundamentally shifted. The broadcast had ignited a massive, uncontrollable wildfire of public outrage. The story of the broken veteran, the heroic war dog, and the malicious corporate billionaire went instantly viral, spreading across social media networks, national news syndicates, and online investigative forums with terrifying speed. When Jax and Smoky finally climbed back into their rusted pickup truck to return to the mountain, they were no longer driving alone. A massive sprawling convoy of news vans, satellite trucks, independent journalists, and outraged citizens had formed a miles-long procession behind them, an unstoppable armored column of public scrutiny rolling westward toward Oakhaven. They reached the dying mountain town just before noon, but Oakhaven was no longer sleeping. The streets, which had been hollow and silent just a day before, were absolutely packed with people. Locals who had hidden in their homes for years were standing on the sidewalks. When Jax's battered truck rolled down the main street, a profound, deafening cheer erupted from the crowd. Evelyn Reed stood on the porch of her diner, wiping tears from her weathered cheeks, as she raised a hand in silent, powerful salute to the veteran who had come to buy a cup of coffee and ended up saving their world. Jax led the massive convoy of vehicles up the treacherous gravel switchbacks, ascending the steep cliff face until they reached the high plateau. The ruins of Blackwood Manor still smoldered, a colossal blackened scar against the white snow, and standing precisely in the center of the ashes, surrounded by a fleet of black luxury SUVs and a team of frantic, completely overwhelmed corporate lawyers, was Silas Vance. The billionaire's immaculate, tailored appearance was gone. He looked pale, frantic, and completely terrified as he watched the endless line of camera crews and townspeople pour onto the plateau, completely trapping him against the edge of the cliff. The dark, isolated shadows where Vance usually operated had been violently ripped away, exposing him to the blinding, inescapable light of 100 camera lenses. Jax stepped out of his truck, Smoky walking tall and proud at his side. The crowd parted respectfully, allowing the veteran to walk directly toward the center of the ruins. Vance's lawyers desperately attempted to shield their client, barking empty threats about trespassing and defamation. But Vance raised a shaking hand to silence them. The billionaire stared at Jax, his eyes wide with the realization that his empire of intimidation had completely collapsed. "You have no proof," Vance sneered, though his voice trembled violently, entirely stripped of its former silken authority. "You are a lunatic standing in a pile of ashes." Jax did not even grant the man the dignity of anger. He simply looked at Vance with profound, absolute pity. "The State Attorney General's office is already securing the geological laboratory, Mr. Vance," Jax replied calmly, the microphones of a dozen reporters picking up every word. "Federal investigators are currently pulling the financial records of your shell companies. You burned a historic landmark to steal a natural resource. You are done here." Jax turned his back on the billionaire, dismissing him entirely, and looked out over the massive crowd of locals and journalists. He pointed a steady finger down toward the smoldering foundation, where the heavy iron trapdoor lay buried beneath the rubble. "Beneath these ashes lies the tear of the mountain," Jax declared, his voice echoing powerfully across the plateau. "And I am officially placing the property deed into an irrevocable public trust managed jointly by the citizens of Oakhaven. We are not going to bottle this water. We are not going to sell it to the highest corporate bidder. We are going to dig out the foundation, and we are going to rebuild this estate together. We are going to build a sanctuary." The roar of approval that erupted from the townspeople shook the very snow from the pine trees. It was a sound of profound, unbridled hope, the sound of a community taking its first deep breath after decades of slow suffocation. Smoky let out a joyous, powerful bark, his tail wagging fiercely as Evelyn Reed walked forward to wrap her arms around the dog's thick neck, completely ignoring the ash and dirt. Winter slowly surrendered to the gentle, thawing warmth of spring, and the long, bitter years of decay finally released their grip on the Oakhaven Valley. Over the next 12 months, the town experienced a miraculous, sweeping resurrection. The federal investigation into Silas Vance dismantled his corporate empire entirely, resulting in massive civil penalties and criminal indictments that permanently removed him from the mountain. With the immense collective funding provided by historical grants, public donations, and the sheer, physical willpower of the local community, the blackened ruins on the cliff were cleared away. 1 year later, a new structure stood on the edge of the world. The Ironwood Springs Wellness Retreat was a breathtaking architectural homage to the original manor, constructed from massive, locally sourced timber and expansive walls of natural glass that reflected the surrounding peaks. It was not an exclusive, high-priced luxury resort for the wealthy elite. It was a holistic, therapeutic sanctuary, specializing in the treatment of severe trauma, physical rehabilitation, and psychological recovery. Deep within the bedrock, the hidden cavern had been carefully, respectfully expanded. The miraculous geothermal spring now flowed into a series of beautiful, open-air mineral pools that steamed gently in the crisp mountain air. Veterans who had lost their way in the civilian world traveled from across the country to soak in the healing waters, finding peace in the absolute silence of the mountain. The town of Oakhaven thrived once more. Evelyn Reed's diner was packed every morning with laughter and the smell of fresh coffee. The storefronts on Main Street were repaired and reopened, and the community had finally reclaimed its soul. Jax Harlan stood on the expansive, wrap-around wooden deck of the new retreat, leaning comfortably against the sturdy railing. He was no longer the hollow, haunted ghost shivering in the cab of a rusted truck. The deep, heavy bags under his eyes had vanished, his shoulders were relaxed, and the crushing weight of the war had finally been laid to rest. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, the unofficial director of a sanctuary that had saved his life. Beside him, resting in the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun, was Smoky. The German shepherd's coat was thick, shining, and meticulously brushed. The jagged scar across his right shoulder was completely healed, a faded silver badge of courage hidden beneath the fur. Smoky lifted his massive head, inhaling the clean scent of pine and mineral steam, before resting his chin heavily on Jax's boot. Jax reached down, his fingers burying deep into the warm fur behind the dog's ears, massaging the strong muscles of his neck. They looked out across the vast, breathtaking expanse of the valley, watching the sun slowly dip behind the jagged, snow-capped peaks, painting the sky in a brilliant tapestry of fire and violet. For so many years, Jax had believed that the violence of the world had broken him beyond repair. He had believed that once a man's soul was shattered, the pieces could never be put back together. But as he looked at the thriving, happy people walking through the courtyard below and felt the steady, powerful heartbeat of the heroic dog leaning against his leg, he finally understood the deepest truth of the mountain. Healing is never a solitary journey. It is a profound, messy, and incredibly beautiful act of defiance against the dark. Sometimes salvation does not come from a doctor or a pill or a profound realization. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of a rotting house on a dying mountain. And sometimes the only way a man can truly save his own life is by fighting with every ounce of his strength to protect the life of a loyal dog who simply refused to leave his side. "We held the line, brother," Jax whispered softly into the mountain wind, a profound, unbreakable peace settling permanently into his heart. "We held the line, and we finally made it home." Smoky offered a single, resonant thump of his heavy tail against the wooden deck, his amber eyes reflecting the beautiful fading light of a brand new day. The war was over, the mountain was safe, and the bond forged in the fires of survival would echo through the quiet valley for the rest of their lives. If this story of incredible resilience, unbreakable loyalty, and the healing power of the human spirit touched your heart today, we ask that you do something simple. Leave a comment below, tell us where you're watching from, or simply type loyalty if you believe that the love of a good dog can truly save a person's soul. If you found value, inspiration, or a moment of peace in Jax and Smoky's journey, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might need to hear it, because the next story about courage, redemption, and the extraordinary animals who stand by our side in the darkest of times might be exactly what you need. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.